Great lawyers don't always know how to build great law firms. Let's change that. Join Ben Gideon as he shares hard-won lessons from building his own financially successful law firm and practical insights from top law firm entrepreneurs, business consultants, and more. This is a podcast for lawyers, by lawyers. Welcome to Elevate, Build, and Grow Your Law Firm. Produced and powered by Law Pods.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Elevate, Build, and Grow Your Law Firm. I am Jeff Wright, Chief Operating Officer here at Gideon Asen, and as always, joined by owner, partner, managing partner extraordinaire, Ben Gideon. Morning, Ben.
Hey, Jeff. Why don't we start with our sponsorship promotions?
I would love that. We're proud to say that this podcast is sponsored by three fantastic businesses, and Ben, if you want to speak on behalf of our first sponsor, Supio.
Yeah, sure. So Supio is an AI platform built for plaintiff trial lawyers. I know a lot of lawyers who use it, who absolutely love it. I'm a member of a group called Injury Board, and it's among the top trial lawyers all over the country. And it has been widely adopted throughout Injury Board. Many of the law firms there are using it. In fact, many of them were instrumental in helping to build it and provide feedback for its functionality. So it's really tailored for trial lawyer use, used by a lot of the top high-end trial firms. Highly recommended. You should check them out at supio.com.
Great. We're also proud sponsors of an amazing nonprofit called 1% for the Planet. 1% for the Planet is a global environmental nonprofit. It was founded in 2002. It's pretty simple. Businesses commit to donating at least 1% of their annual sales to environmental causes. We know a lot of companies want to support environmental causes, but they struggle with identifying nonprofits that are trustworthy and also how to make the biggest impact with their dollars. 1% for the Planet solves all of that by vetting all their participating environmental nonprofits and connecting your business with organizations that match your values. We're more than thrilled to be participating with them. And if anyone out there signs up for 1% for the Planet, please let us know, and we'll be happy to give you a shout out on this show.
And finally, we're brought to you by Vision Spark. Vision Spark is a company that we've referenced before. We used that company to do our COO search that produced Jeffrey Wright. So far, we're very pleased with that result. They were fantastic to work with. And I should point out that we have an ongoing relationship with Vision Spark. We continue to work with them to do all of our vetting of our employee personality and psych testing, which we have found incredibly valuable, and we've spoken about that previously on the show. We have developed a profile specifically for trial lawyers. So if you're in the trial business, you might be able to reach out and replicate that. But if you need a chief operating officer, a CEO, or any other high-level administrative officer of your firm, we recommend Vision Spark.
100%.
So with that, why don't we turn to today's topic, Jeff? I think our topic today is going to be on the very exciting topic of insourcing versus outsourcing of responsibilities.
You know, it may not be the most exciting thing in the world, but it's a discussion that's happening. You mentioned Injury Board a little while ago, and there was a firm that reached out to Injury Board and wanted to talk about whether they should insource or outsource a COO and a marketing person. And I spent some time speaking with that firm. So we do think these are discussions happening at other firms. And Ben, I don't know if it makes sense to kind of start at the beginning. You've obviously alluded to the fact that when you and Taylor started, you were jack of all trades. You were IT, you were facilities, you were finance. And at what point did you feel you had to have the outsourcing discussion where you knew you had to bring on other assets to handle those things, either in-house or outsourced?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jeff. I mean, one reason I wanted to do an episode on this topic is it's something that when we started our firm, and I would say still through to today, it's a constant decision point of whether for a particular task or functionality, you're better off spending the time, money, and effort to build that internally versus going out and finding a vendor that can supply that product or that service to you for a charge. In some sense, we've discovered what the right balance for our firm is through trial and error in some instances, attempts that have failed, things that have worked. And I thought I would sort of share some of that with our listeners that might help them enhance their ability to get to the right decisions in their own course. So I mean, when you start your firm and you're building it from the ground up, one exciting thing I thought about the ability to outsource certain tasks is that it allows you to develop a larger footprint really from the inception than you might justify based on the internal numbers of your operation. So a firm that has, as we did when we started, just two lawyers and a couple of support staff can operate like a somewhat larger firm by selectively outsourcing certain tasks and duties. I think there was a time for a law firm, and not a time in recent past, but a decade plus ago, where probably the standard workflow was, for the most part, for firms to handle everything from soup to nuts for their own operations internally. And I can think back to starting at my last practice where we were still using handheld dictaphones and dictating memos and letters, and then those would get handed off. The cassette tape would literally be ejected from the dictaphone. I know this, I mean, the technology sounds so ancient, but this wasn't that long ago. You would eject your little cassette, your mini cassette, you would hand that to your legal assistant. They would put that into their listening device with the headphones on and a foot pedal, and they would literally create the transcription of your letter or your memo. Someone might proof it, and then it would get circulated around as needed. And that process of having administrative staff transcribe dictation still continued forward to the time that I left that practice about 5 years ago. That there were no longer mini cassettes. I would dictate on my iPhone using an app, and then it would automatically get uploaded or emailed. But the secretary was still transcribing it, proofing it, and et cetera. So one of the very first outsourcing things we did in our new firm was to outsource that transcription function using a company called Rev, which for a very low cost will outsource it to somebody around the world. And, it used to be that you would dictate and that would create a queue for your legal assistant, and they would get to it whenever they could next in their order of priority, managing and juggling all the other things they were doing that were on their plate. That could take a week sometimes. I mean, if you had a lengthy memo that you had dictated, 10-page memo, you might not get that back for a week. Using Rev, you get back a high quality transcription of that memo within about 30 minutes, no matter how many you upload. If you uploaded 100 things, you would still get 100 pieces of work returned to you within about 30 minutes because they're all getting outsourced, obviously, to different people that are, if you're using the human transcription service, which we typically do. There's also the fully automated voice transcription service that's a lower cost that tends to have more inaccuracies. But so that's one example of just a simple outsourcing product. But as you go, you start to identify other areas early on where you can increase your footprint. And they're so accessible today because everything tends to be cloud-based. So if you're using a vendor, they can easily get access to your data, your information, and workflow. So other early examples of areas we outsourced were our IT function. in the old days, people had IT employees that were on site that managed your server room, your hardware, software, etc. Now, I'm sure there are many firms that still have internal IT, and maybe when you get scaled up large enough, that does make sense. But for a small firm, they're very good options for outside vendors that can handle all of your IT functions. The one we use called Team Logic, I think it's a national company, but we work with their, or they might be a franchise. I think they're a franchise business, but the office we work with out of New Hampshire is exceptionally good, very responsive, really nice folks, and they can remote in to your laptop or your desktop and handle almost everything right away without even having to pay a in-person visit to your office. Obviously, no one has server rooms or servers anymore. We get automatic backups so that everything we do is backed up on about a 10-minute cycle. They can help with other things such as cybersecurity issues and things like that that all need to be addressed these days. So as you're building, you start to realize you can act like a larger firm than you are by outsourcing some of these non-essential functions. That's kind of the early phase of it. Let me just kind of explain what there have been vendors we have used that didn't work out well, and where here's a good example. Our firm relies heavily on the ability to efficiently and promptly obtain large volumes of our client medical records, particularly for medical malpractice cases, because we can't even complete a review of the case until we have a complete set of records. For those who don't do this kind of work, but I'm sure there's an analogy in every other type of practice, but it can be extremely frustrating to just get those documents in house because the system is really designed to be inefficient so that it's difficult to get the records you need. No one's very responsive in that world, and it can take weeks or months, which really grinds our whole practice to a halt. We started out, we thought, well, that would be a good task to outsource. It's a routine, administrative, clerical task that is repetitive, really requires the same approach, and it should be something that can be done efficiently by somebody we don't have to employ. We hired a firm to do that. It became a complete disaster. We went weeks, months waiting for records to come in. They never came in, to the point where our entire practice had really ground to a stop. We couldn't create demands for clients because we didn't have records. We couldn't complete case reviews for clients because we didn't have the records. And we were, 6 months away from having no pipeline and source of viable cases because we didn't have the records we needed to perform the work. So then we decided, well, we have to insource that. So we hired somebody to do that job internally. And you know who that was, Jeff. It was Christine. She came in and she did a phenomenal job doing that and kind of salvaging that part of the practice by starting the flow of records coming back into our office, very aggressively pursuing them to make sure they were coming in. Problem solved. However, the problem with that job is it's a thankless job. It's incredibly frustrating. There's a high burnout rate. And after doing that job for, several months, it was clear to us that Christine was just getting burned out of it. We then hired somebody to replace Christine, who Christine trained. And then it became apparent that this person wasn't going to last in that job very long either. And that it started to unravel again. And so we were faced with, and this is sort of a classic dilemma I think firms get faced with in certain areas. It doesn't have to be medical record retrieval, it could be any number of things, but you've got a particular job that's difficult, thankless. There's not a lot of room for professional growth, but it's essential in terms of blocking and tackling to the core function you're trying to do. But what you recognize is you're going to have high turnover and constantly having to train people. They're going to leave. You're going to have to train somebody else. And it's going to be a continual problem going forward for you unless you can find a workaround and a fix. So at that point, rather than continue to hire people and insourcing that responsibility going forward, we then made a second attempt to outsource it, and that ended up being successful. And it was successful because we found a different vendor that performed the service in a very different way than our prior vendor had. And we were very careful in terms of vetting that vendor and following up and managing that process until we felt comfortable it was working well. But now it's a problem that we've solved, and we don't have to internalize it and deal with all of the fallout from having to manage that process in-house. And by the way, that vendor is called Streamlined, and I highly recommend them for anybody who needs medical record retrieval services. This same problem cuts across all aspects of a firm. Most law firms have dealt with marketing vendors. That could be particularly problematic, particularly in, say, web mastery and search engine optimization. We're on our third different SEO vendor, and all our past vendors were problematic in different ways. We can talk more about that in a moment. So fits and starts, trial and error, getting to the point of figuring out what we can insource, what we can outsource, which has led to some kind of takeaways from all that, which I'll share in a moment, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the things you touched on it briefly. You need to have somebody internally that is willing to spend the time to look at multiple vendors, do your research, touch base with other firms, get references, do demos, go through your contracts. And it's a considerable amount of time if you do it correctly, but nothing is worse than signing a multi-year contract with a vendor and you're 6 months into it and you really don't have a good out clause and you realize you made a mistake. So putting the time and effort in, if you do decide to outsource something, you need to do it right out of the gate, and you need to identify somebody in-house, ideally not the attorneys that should be using their time, obviously on cases, but if you don't have that person in-house, you need to identify them.
Yeah. And in our case, that's you, Jeff.
Yeah.
That whole backdrop of trial and error that led to failures and successes with outsourcing in some areas and not others led me to develop some general rules of thumb about what makes sense to insource and what makes sense to outsource and how to distinguish one from the other. So let me just share that, and then we can go through how that plays out maybe in some of the different areas of your firm or practice. So my rule for insourcing is you want to insource core value added services that define the product or service that your firm delivers. So obviously you have a value proposition for your customers, and that key value proposition, whatever your area of law is your legal services, your judgment, your professional experience, your reputation. That cannot be outsourced. People are coming to you for that service, and that's where you're making your name and your brand. So you would outsource that at great peril because no one else is going to have the same reputation you have. They're not going to have the experience you have. And that's ultimately going to dilute your brand, dilute your reputation, and diminish your firm. And that I don't think anybody would argue with that, and that we all know that. The second area where you should insource, and this is the one that's a little bit more interesting, I think, is what I've described as other areas where building unique capacity offers strategic or competitive advantage and can be accomplished at an acceptable return on investment. We can get back to examples of what those things might look like, but that's a critical part. So again, that's in addition to your essential function and core value added proposition as a law firm. I'm talking about other things now, other than your legal services, to insource. So let's talk about what you should outsource. Number one, you should outsource ancillary and routine tasks that are not core to the legal services of the firm and that are more cost effective to outsource. So we already gave an example. Transcription services, medical record retrieval. Those are not core to your legal services. Nobody cares who transcribes the memo or who transcribes the letter or who's responsible for getting the medical records. At the end of the day, it doesn't make any difference to your customer, to your client, to the outcome in the case. It's a back office function. And if you can do that in a more cost-effective way by outsourcing it, you should outsource it. Number two, you should outsource tasks where there is little to no strategic or competitive value in developing individualized capacity. And I will give some examples of that in a moment. And number three, you should outsource tasks. And this is kind of the flip side of that second category. You should outsource tasks where there's actually a strategic advantage to outsource to somebody with a higher level of targeted expertise and experience than what you have, than what you can bring to the table. Now, hopefully that's not in the core area of legal services you're practicing, because if you're not the best or confident in your ability to provide that service, then maybe you should go work for a different law firm until you've burnished your credentials to a point where you can offer, where you feel confident that you are offering something of value from your unique legal services that your firm can offer. But there are other things that you're not going to be an expert at that you would gain value from, and your clients will gain value from having you actually outsource those things. Well, let me stop there, Jeff. Those are the categories I came up with. What are your thoughts about those? Do you have other categories or insights into the ones that I've identified?
No, I actually I think those categories are perfect. I don't have anything in addition to those, but I think a lot of these things, especially your last one, which kind of sounded on the surface like it flies in the face of your earlier ones, it really doesn't when we drill down into that, because there are areas that, you know, our attorneys and our legal services staff are not going to have expertise in, and it makes perfect sense for a strategic advantage to utilize those from a third party. Maybe the most important thing, especially from, you know, a budgetary standpoint, is really identifying those routine or ancillary tasks that you just don't want your people to do. And we were talking, we had a guest on, I forget, months ago, and she was a CFO, and she was still opening the mail every day because it's something she just always did. She'd come into the office, she'd open the mail, she'd sort it, she'd deliver it. And finally someone said to her, you know, what are you doing? At your salary, your time should be spent better elsewhere. And it sounds like such a minuscule thing, but she said that really opened her eyes to what tasks should people not be doing that can either be gotten rid of or can be assigned elsewhere to free up your team to do the work they're supposed to be doing. And identifying those ancillary tasks and getting them off everyone's plate might be the number one thing that I would tell firms to address first. It's the more low-hanging fruit.
Agreed. And it's not just a time wasting issue or that people aren't maximizing the highest and best use of their time with their credentials or their salary. It's also a burnout factor because people are doing thankless, rote, repetitive tasks that don't engage them, that don't engage creativity or their intellectual needs. Those people will leave. And then the time and effort it requires to recruit and train somebody, knowing that they're likely not going to last, those are the perfect things to outsource. Make that somebody else's problem. And there's companies that then they want that business because they've built systems that make those repetitive, thankless tasks something they can do efficiently and people that are, you know, happy to have that work doing those things and probably turn over too, but they build that into their business model. So yeah, so let's move to that. So we've talked about the concepts. So let's move to the practical, how we've implemented those in our firm, and hopefully that will give folks an idea for parallel ways they could be implemented in your own firm. So when I think about the first point, that one thing you want to insource is the core value added services that define the product and service that your firm delivers uniquely to the a client. That doesn't just include the legal services. That includes your vision. So, the visionary elements of your business. We've talked a lot about that. Your unique leadership structure. You can't outsource that. You can't outsource, have somebody else develop your vision for you. You can't have somebody else lead your firm or manage your firm. You need to do that yourself, obviously. We talked about the legal services. So, whatever type of practice you're in, you're going to provide the legal services. That's going to include lawyers. That's likely to include support staff for lawyers, whether paralegals, legal assistants, case managers, whatever is required to perform your value added legal services at the highest level. In our type of practice, I also think the core value added services include our intake process, because the full experience that a consumer has from their contact with our firm, which is very important to us, begins with the first phone call or contact email, and insourcing that to the point of, and what I mean by insourcing it is insourcing the management of it. There can be elements of the intake that we do outsource. We currently, we'll talk about that in a minute, but we don't outsource the process. We don't outsource our evaluation of the data. We don't outsource the triaging of how the cases are going to be triaged and handled. Case evaluation. So that's can start with that first phone call, but it in our case goes forward from that to further analysis of whether this is a case we want. That's also something we really can't and we don't want to outsource. So building that capacity for us is valuable. And it offers us competitive advantage in addition, because it allows us to be able to cast a wide net, to filter out a lot of different cases, to accommodate a lot of referring attorneys who want to send us work because they know we will be responsive. Clients will have a good experience when they have interaction with our firm, and that we won't miss cases. We'll be able to make informed decisions about whether to take a case or not to maximize the value of that case asset. So those are all things you're not going to want to outsource in your own business. That may include the intake function. You may not have a high enough volume that that's something you really need to worry about, but there may be other things that go along with the acquisition of work part of the business that you're going to need to insource. The other area we talked about was areas that you've identified as a business where building unique capacity offers strategic and competitive or competitive advantage that can be accomplished at an acceptable return on investment. So let me give you some examples from our own business of that. So one is operations. So that is Jeff's function as a chief operating officer. So the question is, some firms don't have chief operating officers. They either have nobody who's really full-time in that position, or they may choose to outsource that by working with a vendor to retain a fractional COO, for example. So that's a question of what is that capacity if you own it as a firm versus outsourcing it to a vendor. Where is the tipping point where there's a strategic and competitive advantage to building that capacity internally versus outsourcing it? And if you're going to build it based on your own scale of practice, can you do so at an acceptable return on investment? Now, if you only have a 1 or 2 lawyer firm, the answer to that is probably no. The return on investment from hiring a full-time COO is not an acceptable ROI for a 2 lawyer firm, depending on what the revenue is and so forth. But you get to a point in scaling up that the ROI is acceptable. And in my view, the strategic or competitive advantage to owning that capacity to fully manage operations within your own firm, to develop unique capabilities and people with the institutional knowledge and firm specific knowledge and personal relationships within the office, et cetera, is worth it at a certain point.
Need help on a complex personal injury or medical malpractice case? Gideon Asen accepts case referrals and regularly co-counsels with lawyers nationwide on high-value claims. The firm has recovered millions of dollars in cases that competitors turned away because they dig deeper. Ready to learn more? Email bgideon@gideonasenlaw.com to start the conversation. Gideon Asen shares fees as permitted by the laws of each state. Don't let complex cases overwhelm your practice. Elevate justice together with Gideon Asen.
Jeff, thoughts about insourcing of the COO role?
Yeah, obviously I'm a little biased here, but it also depends on what the firm is going to ask this individual to do and what expectations they have. Ben and Taylor here have given me a lot of responsibility. They've been willing to let go of a number of things. They've entrusted me with, significant decision-making ability, and I could not do this role effectively remotely or as a fractional COO without knowing the cases and, more importantly, knowing the staff and all the employees intimately. I'm much better at my job by being on-site, hands-on, and my ability to manage the day-to-day and manage the personalities and be able to, deliver appropriate answers to the senior management team and make appropriate suggestions couldn't be done as a fractional. If you have a pared down version of your operations, you want them to just handle very specific things, you might be able to get away with it. But if you're going to ask a lot of this individual, it's funny, we just hired a new IECU attorney. And during the interview process, one of the things that she said was intriguing about our firm was the fact that, Ben and Taylor hired a non-attorney to run the day-to-day, and that we're treating it like a business. She has not worked, and this is someone that's been in the field, I think, a dozen years. She said she has not worked at a firm that was structured like that. And that was one of the things that intrigued her about coming to work here.
And that's a great example of where that provides strategic and competitive advantage, because, she was a highly qualified person, great academic background, federal clerkships. Somebody that we think very highly of, and she could probably work in a lot of different places. And she wanted to be somewhere that was well run like that. And having been at other firms that weren't run that way, that was something that was important to her. So that gave us a competitive advantage in that marketplace of recruiting and hiring that we wouldn't have otherwise had. I actually think that's been true of a number of our staff that have come here because they want to be in an environment where they feel supported, where they have somebody that they can work with as a mentor, to help them grow professionally. So that's just one way in which having a full-time COO, I think, does provide you competitive and strategic advantage, especially if you're competing against firms that don't have that, because they're not going to have the ability to execute business operations in the way that we can. And so whether it's a marketing issue or a recruiting issue, or attorney compensation, whatever the case may be, we're going to be able to execute on that better and therefore provide ourselves a strategic advantage. And that just grows over time. So as that capacity improves, our advantage increases. So it's something, in our view, could be done with our scale and acceptable return on investment, and did provide a significant and competitive advantage and continues to do so. Other areas that we've identified like that: finance and financial reporting. Many firms outsource their entire bookkeeping and financial function. We've elected not to do that. We do outsource aspects of that, which we'll get to in a moment, but our core finance function is insourced, because when you've got a business that's managing, millions and tens of millions of dollars running through your accounts, and there's a lot of strategic planning that you need to do based on cash flow and based on understanding revenues and sources of revenue and decisions on expense side of things and compensation. Having that capacity and building that over time is extremely valuable. And the person we have doing that not only does that, but then she translates that into extremely useful reporting that allows us to keep track of all of our KPIs and metrics on a weekly basis to track our progress. Again, I think having that capacity insourced is incredibly valuable. Nobody else on an outsourced basis is going to learn and know our firm like that and be able to provide that level of transparency and detail into our operations at a very intrinsic level that allows us to manage our firm effectively. So again, many firms outsource that, but we've elected to insource it for the reasons discussed. Marketing is another one. Marketing is a tricky one because it's something that as lawyers, we don't have a lot of inherent knowledge or capacity to understand necessarily and manage. And there's lots of different vendors out there that would be happy to take your money to promise you the world in terms of marketing claims that what they can deliver for you. We are barraged by that on a daily basis on social media and email and so forth. We originally, when we started our firm, we had outsourced all of our kind of marketing efforts, SEO. We talked about web management,
Social media,
all of that. And we became increasingly frustrated with that because what we have found in the marketing space is that there's a very formulaic approach to how law firm marketing vendors operate. And it's really no fault of their own. They're all working on small margins. And so the business model is really to provide a standardized, basically cookie cutter program to law firms in exchange for, a monthly fee that can seem quite high for what they're providing, which is very minimal. And you also don't gain any competitive advantage from that because all of your competitors are buying the same standard program from some other marketing vendor that's operating on the same low margin that's providing the same exact service. So everybody has the same website, the same SEO material, the same junky blog posts written by 24-year-old kids who no experience in the law, and et cetera. So at some point, we just decided, if we want to take that function seriously, we needed to insource that and build real capacity. And that has been a really great development for us. We found when we went out to locate somebody to do that job, we were very, very dubious that we would be able to find somebody who could check off all the boxes, that would understand the digital side of marketing, from websites to SEO to social media, but also have enough managerial and strategic insight that could lead that function for us and provide us good advice. But we decided, hey, we'll just put it out there and see, who comes through the door. And we ended up finding somebody who really checked all of those boxes and has been a great fit. And it's really been phenomenal to see how that's translated into building our unique capacity on a marketing front. Jeff, finance and marketing, go.
Yeah, the biggest things for me, and I'll talk generally first, is by us deciding to keep these in-house, we've put a high value on somebody creating institutional knowledge and being able to utilize that knowledge to do their job more efficiently. I think outsourcing marketing or outsourcing your finance, they're not going to have that institutional knowledge. They're not going to know the ins and outs of the firm, and you're going to be missing something. Our finance person is absolutely amazing. We're very transparent with, our finances here, but also a big thing is we make a lot of our decisions, virtually everything, based on science and data. And we're doing, internal projections on case costs and internal projections on when case resolutions are going to happen and what our cash flow is going to look like. That's very difficult to do at that granular level by outsourcing that function. We do have an outside bookkeeping firm, and very recently, we had a bookkeeper, and the firm outgrew them. And there's nothing wrong with that. You're gonna outgrow vendors as you begin to scale. So like I had talked about before, myself and our head of finance, Christine, vetted some different bookkeeping firms and met with them and got proposals from them and everything and made a determination. We switched about 3 months ago and we're thrilled. And they're a firm that can scale with us. And she works hand in hand with them weekly on things and is able to provide extremely good data that really formulates decisions made at the senior management level. I'd say the same thing for marketing. If you want to outsource it, you just need to realize that firm that you're outsourcing that to is going to be working with 20, 30, 40 other clients. They are not eating, sleeping, thinking about your firm and what can be done and what tweaks they can make. We made a decision with increasing our marketing spend, doing direct to consumer for the first time. We need somebody thinking about Gideon Asen only. If we're going to do this right, we need someone 100% committed to us. And we've brought it in-house. Matt's been with us for, I think, right around a year now. And it's been we wouldn't look back. It was a fantastic decision for us.
Yeah, and the other thing about both the finance and the marketing functions is once you insource it and build the capacity and internal knowledge, it actually makes your vendor relationships better and more efficient and more profitable for you because they can manage those vendor relationships better than you could if you didn't have that capacity. So, for instance, on the marketing side, we still use a third-party vendor to do our webmastering and to do some of our SEO stuff because we don't want our fairly high salaried marketing director to be doing all of the mundane day-to-day things to just keep the website functioning. And if he needs something specific done, he can outsource that to them. But what he does is provides us complete transparency into what they're doing. And he'll say, for example, last month they did these 3 things. That doesn't add any value. I'm going to tell them to stop doing that and to take their dollars and do this other thing with those dollars instead. And so now we're getting good value out of that vendor in addition to having our marketing person. I would say the same on the finance side. We identified a problem with the billing, with the bookkeeper, because we had somebody who was, deeply into that, and we're able to triage that and find a different solution to that quickly. Just some other examples of areas, again, where you can build unique capacity. We did that with our focus groups. We built out a separate company that manages focus groups because what we recognize is we do a lot of jury focus groups. We didn't want to have to spend money on an outside vendor where that can be very expensive. They don't really add a lot of value above what we can do on our own. And we were able to insource that by creating a separate company with a different name that can run social media ads, recruit people for our focus groups, and we can do all that in-house for a fraction of what we would pay if we had to hire someone to perform focus groups for us. And that gives us the flexibility to do a lot more focus groups, and we like doing those. There's another area we've recently discussed about insourcing to build unique capacity, and that has to do with our chief AI officer. I'm going to table that for the moment, and we'll get back to the listeners once we've circled back and made final decisions about that and can report out on that. Let's talk about areas where we've outsourced. So we talked about one area of outsourcing is for ancillary and routine tasks that are not core to the legal services of the firm and are more cost effective to outsource. I already gave an example of that, the transcription service Lex. Second example for our practice, medical records retrieval, Streamlined. Another example, which we alluded to in the context of intake, we outsource elements of that. So while we do intakes with real humans in our office taking phone calls during normal work hours, we have outsourced overflow calls and after hours calls. So if we get too many calls at once, they bounce to the outsource. If they come in on weekends or after hours, they bounce to the outsourced service. We had used one service. It was okay, but not great. And we've recently changed to a different service, and we'll get back to folks on that. But part of our thinking is trying to, particularly with the development of AI, see what elements of the high volume of calls that we need to field can be effectively fielded at a good return on investment without missing important cases, but and still providing a good customer experience can be outsourced using AI. And what percentage of those are we going to continue to have to keep within house and continue to insource? So that's a continuous process that we're very involved in managing. I don't know if you wanted to talk on
Yeah.
that for a moment.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, any firm should be very focused on their intake procedure. I mean, obviously that's where you're probably getting a lot of your cases. It's that first line of defense, it's the first voice. It's you need that person to instill confidence in that potential client and be able to react, as quickly as possible. Ben had talked about, back in the day having the medical records person and that being a very high burnout position. I really think the only potentially high burnout position we have left in-house at the firm is our intake coordinator. We are extremely lucky to have a young woman named Katrina who is just fantastic at her job, but it comes to a point as we're scaling, there's only so much one person can do. We're at a point where you need to make a decision. Do we try and find another Katrina, bring another full-time employee on, pay all the benefits and everything, or do we try and utilize a third party to support her with that after hours, with that overflow, without losing, that personal touch that this firm is very proud to have? And, Ben had alluded to it. We're making a change. They're actually implementing the logic into their AI system as we speak. And I should have that demo back for us to vet this week to see how that goes. But focus on your intake. It's something that you can do a mix of in-house and out-house and outsourced and do it properly.
Agreed. So just to go through some of the other areas, and we have limited time left, but I just want to tick them off so people have kind of a checklist of things. So the second category of areas that are appropriate to insource, in our opinion, are tasks where there's little to no strategic or competitive value in developing individualized capacity. In a sense, they're just things you're not in the business of, that somebody else is in the business of, that they can do better than you, and there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. If they can provide those services at a reasonable cost, you're better off outsourcing them, and insourcing them isn't going to do much for you in terms of your competitive or strategic position anyway. So outsource if possible. So we already talked about one of them, which is information technology, basic IT services, outsource that. Another category we've noted, ancillary HR related. So payroll, we're not in the payroll business. Someone else perfected that business, outsource it. Employment lawyer, outsource it, unless you're an employment lawyer yourself. Ancillary finance related. So we talked about bookkeeping. That's routine stuff, making sure things are in the right columns on the spreadsheet, making sure things are categorized appropriately, outsource it. Outside auditing, obviously that's something you, by definition, need to outsource. Tax accounting, you're going to outsource that. Marketing, ancillary marketing. So although we have a marketing director, as I mentioned, we have an outside firm that does our webmastering, basically maintaining the website, making edits or alterations to it. SEO, some basic SEO functions as managed by our marketing director. Ad and production, video production, that's outsourced. So for doing video, there could come a point where it may make sense for some firms to have a full-time video production capability. I do think that is something in the future we may consider because it could add unique value, but it's hard to see how it adds a lot more value than what it can do for us if we're outsourcing the same function with somebody we've grown to know and trust, and that's worked well for us. Basic design, so designing ads, for example, talking about print ads, things like that, we outsource that. And then here's the category we were talking about earlier, which is kind of the inverse of what we're generally saying, where value-added things, you want to insource them, but there are some kind of more rare and targeted value-added things that you aren't going to be the best in yourself that you may need, and your business is going to be enhanced by outsourcing. So one example I put on our list is appellate work. So we're trial lawyers. We're very good at trying cases. We're very good at getting good results for our clients. We do not do a high volume of appeals. And when you're in a plaintiff's practice, you don't want to do a lot of appeals because it ties up time and ties up money and prevents your clients from getting paid for a prolonged period of time. But when we have high leveraged appeals, there are firms that specialize in handling only appeals. They have the ability to dedicate 100% of their time and attention to doing the appeal in a big case. And we've just decided in some instances that it's better to work with a firm like that than to tie up our own lawyers doing appeals. We're going to get a better work product. It's a good return on investment for a third party to handle that. We do targeted contract work. So sometimes we get a high volume of legal research and writing that needs to be performed, that needs to be done at a high level, but that can be in a discreet way outsourced to a contract lawyer who can do good quality legal research and writing tasks for us and don't tie up our litigators doing an overwhelming amount of legal research and writing. And we get overall a better worked product because we have a single person who can be dedicated to doing one writing assignment at a time. So that's an example. Big data. We do a lot of big data studies in our cases. There are firms that handle big data. We've thought a lot about internalizing the function of doing big data, but it's a big process to acquire this knowledge and skills and infrastructure to do that. At this point, the ROI on that hasn't made sense for us, so we continue to outsource it. We've now chosen to outsource podcast production, as evidenced by LawPod's involvement in this podcast. So there were a number of years in the first 3.5 years or so of doing my other podcast, the Trial Lawyer podcast. We did that, a lot of that in-house, but at some point the ROI to outsource that became obvious, and we now outsource podcast production to LawPods, who does a phenomenal job. Firm consulting. We have an outside consultant we've talked about before, Melissa Shanahan at Velocity Works. Again, that's something we could do in-house. Jeff, you could convene our quarterly meetings. You could run the meetings. We've decided that there's a value in having somebody who's an expert in facilitating meetings handle that for us instead of doing that ourselves. And then another category I have is jury consultants. We hire jury consultants. Again, they're specialized in doing jury selection, helping us with voir dire. We could do that ourselves, but we think there's additional value in outsourcing that. So those are some examples of that. Depending on what kind of practice you have, there's innumerable examples that fit into all of these different categories. I think the key here, takeaway, is start with those big picture categories. Try to think strategically and critically about, each item. Does it make more sense to insource it? Does it make more sense to outsource it? And if anybody has questions about it or looking for, possible vendors that we've used and liked, happy to field any questions from folks. Just send us an email or give us a call.
Absolutely. Good. I know we're coming up against time, Ben, and your next appointment. So that was good. Very well thought out.
Yeah. It's when you start going down the list, you realize it's a lot of stuff.
There is a lot.
I probably only covered about 2/3 of it, but it gives you a sense.
Yeah, it's a lot more decisions than you think there is.
Yeah. When you see the checks go out, you realize that. But hopefully they come in at equal rate. Well, thanks, folks. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to Elevate, Build and Grow Your Law Firm. Share with colleagues if you found it valuable. Remember, building a successful law firm takes discipline, strategy, and determination. But you're not alone. Produced and powered by LawPods.